All right, welcome everyone to our session on looking back to the future. We will get started in 1 minute while other people are still joining. All right, well, I think we have a critical mass here. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. My name is Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the GovLab, and I'm a research professor here at the Tandon School of Engineering at New York University. And I'm delighted to be the moderator of what will be a most insightful looking back and looking forward as it relates to data and AI. So welcome to our session on looking back to the future. And we thought, given the fact that this is the beginning of the year, and Happy New Year to all of those who are joining, we thought it would be a good moment to start the year with some perspective on both what happened last year that will have remaining impact, and also what can we expect in 2026 as it relates to data and as it relates to, of course, AI and governance of both data and AI as such. Suffice to say is that the year has started with a bang in many ways. And it also suffices to say that 2025 was memorable for many developments, both good and, of course, challenging as well. Many have seen that at the international level, we saw increased activity as it relates to AI governance and also as it relates to data governance. Being some of you might remember that 2025 started with the AI Action Summit in Paris, which basically brought many actors together and started the whole discussions about what's the role of AI governance at a global level and how should we go about it. But at the same time, as some of you might know, we are also in the midst of what I have called a data winter, where on the one hand, we have an AI summer, but we actually also see a rapid decline in access to data for public interest purposes. And so what we will do in this session is to look back, what are the key lessons from 2025, key developments, and then also, of course, looking forward, what can we expect and have a few predictions that perhaps next year in 2027, the same panelists can come back and see to what extent we were aligned with what happened and to what extent this kind of predictions held true. And I'm here, of course, not by myself. Next slide, please. I'm here with an amazing panel that will bring different perspectives. And so I'm delighted to introduce the panel, which includes Susan Aaronson, who is a research professor of international affairs and director of the Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub, and is also the principal or co-principal investigator with the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Standards and Technology Institute on responsible AI. Then we have Jet Sundwall, who is the executive director of Radiant Earth and has a long-standing background in open data, where he, at AWS, for instance, where he was the lead on open data and has done a lot of work on making sure that we have access to data and data products. And last but not least, we have Guilherme Canela, who is the director for the Division for Digital Inclusion and Policies and Digital Transformation, and is also the Secretariat of the Information for All program at UNESCO, and is calling in from Paris, and Susan is calling in from DC, and I think, Jet, you're calling in from Seattle. So we have kind of multiple time zones here as well. So with that, and we can perhaps close the slide deck, let me get started with looking back. And Jet, if I can call upon you first. You're also in the earliest time zone, so I thought perhaps you might have the brightest early ideas here to get started. Obviously, you've done a lot of work and Radiant Earth is doing a lot of work on access to data, and especially geospatial data. So eager to hear, if you look back on 2025, which from my perspective is already kind of whatever has happened in 2026 kind of ages ago. But if you look back to 2025, what are some of the developments, both technologically and policy-wise, that you feel stood out and that we should kind of take into account if we are looking forward in a few seconds? Over to you.
Sure. Um, a few things come to mind. Foremost is it's very new. It's very nascent. A thing called Common Space, but it's a nonprofit that uh, was established in 2025 to create and launch their own humanitarian satellite. So their issue being that recognizing that a lot of the actors who have access to high resolution satellites and imagery and can control those things might not prioritize humanitarian efforts. And they're like, well, we can actually launch our own satellite, so let's figure it out. And this follows on the heels of the Environmental Defense Fund. They launched and received data from their own satellite, MethaneSat, last year, which notably that satellite was lost. But I think they did prove that, we're in a world now where nonprofits can launch satellites. You could create a nonprofit, you could launch a satellite. And I think there's a long trend towards you could wrap this up in the sort of the concept of citizen science, which is just the fact that access to computing and sensors and things like that is increasingly democratized, and we're no longer always reliant on big state actors or other, large organizations to produce planetary scale data. So that's a kind of a policy technology thing. I could say more about embeddings, so ways that people are using AI embeddings to compress Earth imagery and make it more accessible to more people. That's something that's potentially very exciting, but still pretty theoretical at this point. But that was a huge part of our world in 2025 as well.
Great. And are there other, because ultimately, so the embeddings, of course, anyway, refers to kind of the role of AI in
Yeah,
actually preparing data and making even data more accessible, right? So, what,
yeah,
from your perspective, Jed, what role has AI played in actually advancing access to data? Because a lot of the discussion about data and AI is about having access to data for AI, but AI
right.
can actually be used to facilitate access to data. And so eager to hear how has that played out from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, well, I do think, I mean, embeddings are, I think, one of the most interesting things here in terms of access
Mhm.
because, and embedding outputs trained on satellite imagery are just much, much smaller than all of that imagery that people normally have to sift through. So they really do stand to make much more data much more accessible to people. There's still so much though to be determined in terms of like how reliable are they? What are they even telling us? Because it's somewhat mysterious in terms of or I don't want to say mysterious, but it's inscrutable for most people to understand like what's in the embeddings. But they do make data much more accessible because they make it smaller. So anything you can do to compress data will make it easier to move around and more accessible to people. So that's exciting. The other thing I'd say around AI is that it does grease the skids in a way for people to use standards more easily. So some of the kind of the boring chore work to adhere to standards or adopt a new standard, AI models, large language models that are writing code make that a lot easier. So that's I think that's been a really a boon for our community and getting people to use standards more easily.
Great. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
And what I always forget, of course, is that for those who joined today, feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box because, of course, this is not just about a discussion among the four of us, but also eager to hear whether anyone has any questions or any comments. So feel free to use the Q&A and also feel free to then indicate who you address the question to, whether it's to everyone or to a particular panelist as well. So let me go to Guilherme. This is already a great start to kind of reflect back and canvas a few kind of key points to then build upon on what might happen in 2026. But Guilherme, of course, you're at UNESCO, and of course, at the global level, multiple multilateral bodies have and international organizations have been very active in 2025. And your focus is, of course, mainly on digital inclusion or even information for all. And so, from your perspective, was 2025 a positive year as it relates to digital inclusion? If so, what happened that you feel was positive, or to what extent do you feel was it more challenging? Over to you, Guilherme.
Hello, everyone. Happy New Year again. Pleasure to be with you. So first, I think we need to bear in mind, since I'm speaking from the perspective of the multilateral system, that 2025 was really a year of tectonic changes in the multilateral system. I guess all of us that ever read Thomas Kuhn were always wondering when we are going to actually witness it, a paradigm shift, as he mentioned in the book. And I guess last year was about that. What we have experienced last year, not only related to AI across the border, and we need really to understand that is very, very different of everything we have experienced since we started the new social contract after the World War II with the creation of the United Nations system and the multilateral system post World War II. So whatever happened last year was happening in these very, very strong moving pieces in the multilateral system. And which means that it was a very difficult moment for the decision-making process. Different actors were not behaving as they used to be. And there was a clear attack against the idea of doing multilateral policy and multilateral governance. And in that sense, it impacted the issue and impacted, I would say, negatively, right, in what was happening. But at the same time, I think there was some positive signs. For example, there was a conscience that we need to be more coordinated in the conversation. I mean, with
Hmm.
the AI hype of different agencies, funds, and programs in the UN system and regional organizations were trying to do something about AI and so on. I guess it's a bit natural when you have something so revolutionary like that taking place. But I guess 2025 there was some accommodation in saying, okay, let's try to do some things more coordinated. So if you see, for example, the 80th session of the UN General Assembly, one of the few resolutions that was approved without a vote, which means some sort of consensus, was the 20th review process of the World Summit on Information Society, which was mainly focused on the new challenges of AI, but still saying that the key aims of the WISES, that is, technologies should be human rights centric, should be neutral in the sense that the problem is not each specific new development, but the overall framework that we. So I think this is positive in the middle of a very complex
Hmm.
story, right?
Hmm.
And maybe I can say two final things and to conclude this initial is I also think there was a thinking in terms of data governance and AI governance that was going beyond the idea of large language models. So different regions and different places were also thinking about what we are talking, where should we talk also about these smaller models and what are the different approaches in terms of policy making. And of course, this is very important for many reasons, including for environmental reasons. So this is one. And secondly, I also think that the different caucus also started thinking that they have specificities in this conversation. So, for example, I joined the J20, that is the caucus of chief justices of the G20, and the judiciary is realizing that AI is making a revolution for the good and for the bad in the judicial systems, including in terms of data governance. But this very specific is not the same as when you're talking to health professions. So I think this is a positive change because it's looking into we need to get much more specialized in this conversation, and this was happening while the rest of the world was moving like a tectonic change, as I mentioned.
Great. Thanks so much, Guilherme. And I will come back to some of those in a second, but I want to loop in Susan already as well. Um, and so we've heard from Jet as it relates to a few developments at the kind of technological and kind of operational level. And then Guilherme, of course, reflect on kind of the multilateral environment. Your work mainly focus, or anyway, among your work, you focus on, of course, developments of data governance also at the national level, and especially developments that may impact cross-border data sharing, which is, of course, a key area that anyway you've been focusing on. So, what are some of the developments in 2025 that you felt are memorable, both positive and negative?
Well, I think that, let me say that China has thus far unveiled several data markets. And the idea is that we bring data sales into the open. These markets are shockingly unsuccessful thus far compared to other markets within China, but the idea is one that I would support. Moreover, this is not what you asked, but I want to say one other
Yeah,
thing,
yeah,
which
no, of
is
course.
I'm not a fan of how Chinese leaders choose to govern their nation, but they have done something quite revolutionary in terms of AI, LLM governance. They want to look at the use and the users rather than regulating the technology or the business practices. So they want to make sure that young people, instead of doing an outright ban, as Australia has done, young people can't use chatbots on social media, that kind of thing, which it's too early to assess if this is successful or not. China has basically said, here are certain types of uses of chatbots that we think are dangerous, and they put out this draft regulation for public comment, which in itself for a repressive state is quite interesting. So that's one development. So on the data, just to summarize on China, the data market approach, while interesting and experimental, thus far has not garnered a lot of companies to participate in these markets. China's approach to regulating these developments, I think, is quite interesting. And let's contrast that with the United States on free flow of information. In 2024, before Trump became president again, the United States did its first explicit limits on the free flow of certain types of personally sensitive data to what it called terrorist nations. And those are 6 nations. I won't go into detail unless anyone wants it, but it's the first time that the United States, which has been the leader of efforts to encourage the free flow of data across borders with certain exceptions. And this has led now to a huge debate about the national security implications of data. And I worry very much that this is setting a precedent that, along with data sovereignty efforts, will lead to less data sharing. And that in turn is deeply troubling because AI is a global product built on global data, and it can never be improved if we don't bring more people online and their data online and their cultures and their insights. And so once we start to have data sovereignty as well as national security restrictions, we will have less science and less technology. And so this very much worries me. One can create all sorts of exceptions, and sometimes those exceptions are necessary, but the world will be a darker place if we don't share lots of info and don't collaborate on data. End of lecture.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for that, Susan. And thanks for bringing the notion of sovereignty to the table, because I think that's definitely, if there would be kind of like every year you have those magazines and newspapers developing the word of the year that kind of was used the most. I think sovereignty, definitely digital and data sovereignty, definitely was kind of on everyone's mind in 2025, and we might come back to that in a second as well. But also thanks, Susan, for reminding us that the other kind of emerging topic in the data space is exactly digital well-being. And that's something, and also Guilherme, that is interesting in terms of access to information, because it's not just about increasing access to information, it's about increasing access to information that is positive and beneficial to society, right? And what we've seen is actually a lot of the access to information has actually been negatively harmful to certain groups in society as well. And I think we do need to start dealing with that. Anyway, those that are advocating for access to data need to also start dealing that not all access is positive, right? And I think that's something that is kind of, from my perspective, an element that really came through in 2025 as well. So let's move to 2026 now, right? So we are, what is it, January 8th. We already have had a lot of developments at the international and national level. So what do we expect to stand out? Anyway, if we would come back here on December 31st, what do we think is going to have a lasting impact in 2026? Over to you, Jet.
Yeah, so I think we're going to continue this trend of seeing non-state actors producing really critical data sets. So this, I don't know where this fits in the data sovereignty conversation, but an interesting data set or data product that came out last year was from the Technical University of Munich. It's the largest by far, is their most comprehensive data set of building footprints, but it's also three-dimensional. And so this is a product they derived from all sorts of satellite imagery and other data they were able to find. But this is a planetary scale data set produced by one research lab in Munich. More of these things are going to keep coming out, and I think some of them are going to gain traction, and they're going to become regarded as like official sources of data, like de facto official sources of data. Another project that I'm really bullish on and interested in is called Overture Maps Foundation, which is a consortium effectively created by Meta, Amazon, Microsoft, and TomTom, and then a bunch of other members who have joined subsequently. But they're producing a global mapping product and also producing something that they call GERS, which is the Global Entity Resource System, I think is what the S stands for. But where they're creating unique identifiers for all things on the planet. This feels kind of like governance stuff. This is the sort of thing you would expect a nation state to be able to do. But of course, who's going to do it at planetary scale? It's not going to be one nation state. And so a few companies came together and did it. I think it's a really remarkable experiment. We're going to see much more activity from non-state actors in producing very large scale, planetary scale data products that I think will become de facto standards that all sorts of people come to rely on.
I think
this might be wish casting. I think I want this
well,
kind of thing.
I mean, now is the moment, Jet, and so hopefully that anyway, people will make it through then.
Yeah.
But that's super interesting, Jet, because anyway, another which I didn't hear, but anyway, if I would have folks from anyway certain parts of the world, they would say that a key element in 2025 was also the destruction of actual data, right? And
Yeah.
so it would be interesting to see whether the trend that you are anticipating will be able to counter or at least complement the so-called official data that is not available anymore for a variety of reasons, either lack of funding or actually actively taking it down. And so, do you see this as a counter trend, Jet?
I do. I mean, I see it as a correction of
Yeah.
sorts. I mean, look, I think I'm an American. I think it's a feature of American politics and public life that we're always skeptical of the government. I think these days there are a lot more reasons to be very skeptical of stuff that the government says, but that's my opinion. There are other people in the country that felt differently when Biden was in power, or I guess would be very skeptical of Biden. So the thing is, like, I think the government should always be approached with some degree of skepticism. I don't think that's a bad thing. And I would just say I am certainly alarmed and somewhat disturbed by, I think, what I would say sort of like bad faith activity happening in the United States right now at the federal level. But the fact that we have so many avenues to counter this, to use your term, I think is a good thing. And I think it's I'm not like that dismayed by something that I think we maybe should have realized a long time ago, which is that the government is one stakeholder among many that can produce data and that we can rely on. And I think the more actors that we bring into this, the better.
Great. Thanks so much, Jet.
Yeah.
Guilherme, over to you. So if you look into your glass ball here, or whatever it's called, in terms of what will happen in 2026, what do you anticipate as it relates to kind of the issues that you work on or any other kind of topics, of course?
So I have a laundry list here, not very long. So there is an interesting milestone in 2026. It's the 260th anniversary of the very first freedom of information law in the world, which is the Swedish law from 1766. And it connects with the way Jed was finishing his last comment. We took 260 years to develop regimes, principles, frameworks for access to information. But considering as the main or maybe the sole actor in this story, including in terms of access to data, being governments. And it's a long time now, not 260 years, that the government's not the main producer of data, or is not the only key producer of data. But we still are far away of understanding how we produce the same regimes, principles, institutions for the other actors that are not the governments.
Mhm.
So I think it will be a major discussion in 2026. Some people like Pansy Klekula, the regulator in South Africa, is already doing that. It's what we do to change the freedom of information regimes to include other actors. And so far, among the 140 freedom of information laws in the world, only a few, and mainly the most important one, the South African, are including private actors. Most of these 140 laws are mainly about government. So this is one. Second, we are 4 years to conclude the 2030 agenda. That is very much based on data for producing evidence-based policy. So we will need to start thinking what is the day after of this agenda with the new data story with AI and so on. I won't further elaborate, but this impacts every single area of international policy. And we are still far away of thinking how is the new story regarding this. Third, last year we had a very interesting development in COP30 in Brazil that for the first time in history, information integrity was included in the final political document. So we will need to walk the talk towards COP31 and see what does that actually mean when we are talking about data and AI, etc., with this planetary challenge that is the climate change story. It's a good thing that was included in the political document, but now we need to walk the talk. And final thing to not go too long, I think several actors are already realizing one thing you were mentioning, Stephen, that uh, if we don't have accurate and reliable data and information, and at the end of the day, quality inputs, whatever quality means, this will be a disaster for the entire landscape, including for the business. Because if you only get more and more rubbish into the system, how you are going to make value of this is not that simple. So we are facing some sort of tragedy of the commons here, right? So how we redo that, how we rethink that, either it is with governance or other means, etc. No one has the answer, but we really need to realize that if we kill science, if we kill independent journalism, if we kill the producers of data with quality and accuracy, then any of these will work. So this is not an issue that is very much in the agenda, but it must be in the very heart of the conversations from now on. Right?
Super interesting. Susan, and then I will
Well,
move on
I'm
to some
so
of the.
glad that Guilherme brought up these points because, first of all, I did not know about South Africa, so I'm grateful to learn. But so right now I'm writing a paper about how these rules can be incorporated within um, the WTO. And I realize that's insane, especially in these times as the United States government withdraws from 66 international organizations. It has not yet withdrawn from the WTO, and all of those actions are illegal under US law because treaties are approved and withdrawal can only be done by the Senate. But Donald Trump and his cabinet do not listen to me. Um, but I do think we have to find ways to govern the data that underpins the economy, whether it is AI-enabled technology, whether it is biotechnology, whether it is digital twins, etc. And I do not, and let me tell you why I don't think voluntary mechanisms will be good enough. Recently, I did a paper looking at one aspect of responsible AI, and we looked at what the technical documents said, what the company's website said, and then what chatbots have been trained to say in earlier iterations and in current iterations. And what we found, so we looked at one aspect, which is user welfare and user rights. So user rights would be obviously personal data protection, freedom of speech, etc., and that tension, right? And user welfare would be, if a user says, I feel suicidal or whatever. And over time, obviously, we found change. So clearly, companies are changing their algorithms to reflect these concerns. Only one company didn't. It went from having a protocol to not having one, which was interesting. That was DeepSeek. I don't know if that was for liability reasons. But the point I want to make, sorry for this long-winded um, talk, but is that we did not find that companies really were responsible. And if that is so, we must have mechanisms of governance, whether we use transparency as a means of accountability, whether we mandate behavior, but we have to have that and we have to work together to do so internationally. And as Guilherme said, we have to do so in such a way that we do not have the tragedy of the commons on data. And
And
so I do think the WTO is the place to do that.
right.
I know most people disagree with me, but the reason is because the WTO has long been found to govern cross-border data flows in a trade dispute related to Chinese media. So, and under the Joint Statement Initiative, where they're negotiating e-commerce, it initially included rules to govern cross-data flows. It's not that those rules are no longer there, but they don't have a negotiated draft where all the negotiating countries, there's 86 of them, agree to include it. So it's not excluded, but right now there isn't a draft that everybody agrees on.
And so do you see progress in that area in 2026, Susan? And
I think we need a wake up on data. And I think there are various governments, and I would say the German government, the UK government, that I think are trying to train citizens in how their data is used to create products and services, and to say that, you need control over that data to some extent, and that control can be achieved by good mandates or by other tools. But do I think so? I think that wake up has to come from the people, and I don't see that happening yet. In the EU, I mean, I think you and I would laugh about this, but you know, they tend to have all sorts of laws that are not enforced, such as the GDPR. And I say that because web scraping is a perfect example of how it is not enforced. That shouldn't have, obviously, web scraping is how, so many LLMs were developed. It wasn't their only source of data, but clearly they have breached personal data protection laws. And yet those countries, they have these laws, but the public has not risen up, and they are among the biggest addicts to these sites. So until there is that wake up, I don't think that'll happen. Moreover, we've studied how governments involve their publics, and very few governments really listen to their public on these issues, which is deeply depressing. They listen to elites.
yeah, and thanks for because the other big element, of course, is kind of this massive extraction that we saw in 2025 and earlier in order to train large language models, of course, and for other purposes, including embedding actually as well. And so that's kind of, Susan, building upon that a little bit. So we see kind of anyway, I think the whole kind of open environment, right? So whether it's access to information or it's open data is kind of, I would feel like 2025 was like kind of a moment when there was a realization is that, well, open can be misused. And both in terms of extraction, but also in terms of actually violations of expectations, including user expectations. And so going back to you, Jed, and Guilherme as well, to get you involved in that conversation, do you see that 2026 will be kind of a rebalancing of the open discussion, where it's like open but not under certain conditions, for instance?
Yeah.
And it goes back to the commons and the tragedy of the commons, right? Which is kind of, anyway, how do we deal with making information open, but at the same time, then making sure that the commons remains viable, for instance, right? And I think that's, by the way, one of the concerns that the media has as well, is that, anyway, they've made their information open, but now people don't go to the media anymore. They go to ChatGPT to get informed, using the information that they got from the media outlets as well. And so eager to
Right.
hear, how do you see this play out in 2026? And then we will go to some of the questions that we have. Thanks everyone for posing questions that are in the chat, in the Q&A as well. Over to you, Jed and Guilherme, or Susan, you may kind of react to that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actively trying to reframe the conversation around open, and we have been for years. I mean, years ago at Radiant Earth, we wrote a blog post called "We Don't Talk About Open Data," which was basically a reflection on the fact that the term open is a sloppy term. It's imprecise. It doesn't capture, I think, some of the most important issues that we're dealing with. And so, and over the years, I've become more emboldened, to sort of betray my community, because I've been an open data guy my whole career. But I think our focus on openness has led us down some dead ends, I would say, because the easiest way to summarize it is that openness is an attribute of a data product. Is the data product good? Is it worthwhile to people? Is it being produced ethically? Is it being used ethically? Do we know what it's for? These are really important questions. Whether or not it has an open license, or what the terms of use are another question. But it is not. I think for way too many years we operated under the assumption that, like, well, let's put some data out there, we'll make it open, it'll be fine. And that ignored all these issues around the cost of maintaining data. And as we're now discussing, the implications of putting it out into the world, and what certain actors could do with it, and how much value they could extract from it. Personally, like, I'm not that mad. I mean, I kind of like the idea of large language models hoovering up tons of information and making it accessible to people. I think there's a lot to be gained from that. But I do think that we've encountered finally this sort of like rude awakening, which is that producing high quality data and making it perfectly openly available is expensive, and somebody has to figure out how to pay for that. And I don't think it's inappropriate to ask, venture-backed billion-dollar companies to pay their fair share, and we need to figure out how to do that. That is a violation of the concept of openness. When we say, it's open for some people but not others, that's not open anymore. And I think it's okay for us to have that conversation. It's overdue.
Great. Guilherme, any reactions from your end? And then we go to some of the questions.
Yeah, no, very briefly. Of course, I mean, all these kind of very large, what a political scientist would say, omnibus concept, right? Like open or development. You need to then give the details of the concept, right? But I still think the idea has a lot of value. What we need to look is the different models that are out there, even in different areas. If you look in science, for example, the open diamond access for scientific publications has some interesting features. You might agree or disagree with some of them, but I think there is no other way. We will need to get more specific in the conversation. And I was saying, if you take the open government movement, that also was looking a lot of open data coming from governments. Again, they were concentrating a lot in defining those things related to data produced by governments. But we are in an entirely different ball game now. So this same experience will need to then take some lessons learned and try to understand how we do that when the players in the playground are very different from the ones when we started this conversation many years ago. Right?
Great. Maybe we could, and Susan, do you want to react to any of the suggestions or comments made as well? Otherwise, we go to the questions here.
The only thing I want to say is we didn't talk about surveillance capitalism.
Right.
And, I am very frightened by our failure to do so. And I feel like the Trump administration's approach to governing data and governing AI is, I don't get it. They like to talk about how transparent they are, but lots of data sets have been killed. And we don't have obligations on the private sector to make their data as open as possible. And as you guys talked before, we um, might not want to do that until we have good ways to protect personal data. And I'm not a fan of synthetic data. I haven't yet seen any evidence that that in general is going to work over the long term. There are always ways to figure out people. So the fact that we haven't tackled surveillance capitalism and we haven't created a culture of openness, these two things in tandem really worry me. But what to do about it, I don't know. And I get the resentment given how the Trump administration deals with Canada's digital tax and the EU social media regulations. I'm really worried, and I think over the long term, surveillance capitalism will be resisted by many countries, and perhaps that's a good thing. Not yet, but I think we will see. And that will lead to, I fear, a bifurcated market for data and lots of protectionism, data protectionism, which, other people call data sovereignty, but I think when you discriminate among producers of data or you discriminate, there are good reasons you might need to do so. But I think in the long run, I already said this is not going to be good for our children and their children. So we got
Okay.
to figure out some answers to this. And I don't have any answers, but
Well, it goes to the first question, Susan, which is basically what are the areas that lack academic research that should or research that should be advanced? Any would you say the issues that you raised, Susan? Would you say, well, we need more research, or is it more action from your perspective?
well, let's just say that you cannot address NSF is not going to fund projects. Well, that try to address surveillance capitalism or look at mechanisms of governance and trust that require real regulation, which is deeply disturbing to me because people do not trust that system. And in the long run, US exports will not be successful if they're not trusted. So I think the Trump administration is doing everything they can to undermine that. Regarding research, so what about the private foundations? And I don't know about you, Stefan, but I've struggled to get funding for data research, and I'm not sure why. But this is not just the Trump administration. I really would love to partner more with the bank or UNESCO or other organizations or UNCTAD that are working in these areas, but I think the United States and US researchers are now tainted, so that's my opinion. What do you all think?